Welcome to Crosstalk Solutions. My name's Chris, and this is FreePBX 101 version 15, part 20, where we're going to be talking about outbound routes. And actually, part 20 and part 21. This is your inbound and outbound routing for FreePBX. So hopefully, after the last couple of videos, you now have a SIP trunk set up in your system. But in order to fully utilize that SIP trunk, we need to tell FreePBX how do we send calls outbound and how do we want to receive calls and route them to various places inbound. So that's what this video on outbound routes and the next video on inbound routes are going to cover. But first, if you are enjoying this series, make sure you give me a thumbs up and subscribe so that you don't miss any of the episodes in this FreePBX series or any of the other tech videos that we put out on the channel. Okay, here we are at the dashboard of FreePBX, and notice that I have this error back that says you have no emergency route set up on the system. That's because I deleted the outbound routes that we created in the previous video so that I could recreate them for this video, but we're going to cover it in more depth. Okay, so to get to outbound routes, we're going to go to connectivity and then click on outbound routes right here. And we want to add a new outbound route. So the first outbound route that we're going to add is just a standard default outbound route for normal calling. So we're just going to call this one default. The route caller ID is your phone number. Basically, what phone number do you want to outpulse to the outside world? Now, when we talk about caller ID, this is the route level caller ID. There is also extension level caller ID. There's also trunk level caller ID. And different caller IDs supersede other caller IDs in various places in FreePBX. So the extension caller ID, if you've set a specific caller ID on your extension, it is going to override the outbound route caller ID as well as the trunk caller ID. If you have an outbound route caller ID, it is only going to override the trunk caller ID. So there's kind of a caller ID hierarchy there that you have to be aware of. So we're going to put in our route caller ID of 272.207.2040. And there is some more information about caller ID if you hover over the question mark, including if set, this will override all caller IDs except for, and then it gives you all the various examples of caller ID that will override the one that we've set on this outbound route. Now, as we talked about, the extension caller ID will override this outbound route caller ID unless, of course, you've selected override extension if you set that to yes. We're not going to do that in this case, however. I try to keep things as default as possible, and then you can look through the various items and change things off of the default if that's a better option for your own environment. So route password, we're not going to use here, but you might want a route password if, for instance, you are doing international dialing and you don't want anyone to be able to dial internationally if they have to have this route password in order to dial an international call, which you can also actually do with PIN codes. There is a whole PIN code setting of FreePBX, but that's going to be beyond the scope of this series. So for route type, we're not going to select either of these things since it's not an emergency route. We will be setting one up later though, nor is this an intra-company route. So music on hold, you can choose if you want. Typically, I'm just going to leave this default, and you're very rarely going to hit music on hold in an outbound route anyways. So time zone, we're not going to do any sort of time matching, but you can basically set up different time groups where maybe you want one outbound route to be used during business hours and a different outbound route to be used outside of business hours or something like that. And then we have our trunk sequence for the matched routes, and you can add as many as you want here. FreePBX is always going to try the first trunk in your sequence. So for instance, Crosstalk SIP outbound, and then it will fail over to any subsequent trunks that you put in here. So if Crosstalk SIP outbound 1 is unavailable, we'll go to outbound 2, outbound 3, outbound 4, outbound 5, and so forth. Okay, so we have our trunks set up. We're basically telling this outbound route, use these trunks in this order, but we have not yet told this outbound route what are we matching as far as what our employees have dialed, right? So they're going to be dialing stuff on their phone, and then we look at what they dialed and we match it to the outbound route. So they have a dial patterns wizards here that is actually very helpful for setting up dial patterns. So we're going to say dial pattern wizard, and then you can manually put in some dial patterns if you want. You can see how dial patterns work. You can read more about it up here. But I like to use the wizard and just choose for a default outbound route, 7-digit, 10-digit, 11-digit. We're going to uncheck emergency since this is not an emergency route. I'm also going to check long distance, and you'll see why in just a second. Long distance is actually going to duplicate 11-digit dialing patterns, but regardless, we're going to go ahead and do that. You can also select US toll-free, but I'm going to talk about toll-free in just a second. So let's hold off on that for now. We're going to say generate routes. And now what we've done here is we've created all these weird looking codes. Well, essentially these are your dial patterns. And there's 4 different fields here per dial pattern. We have a prepend, a prefix, the actual matched pattern, and then a caller ID. So you can open up the pattern help here, and this will tell you a lot more about what we're actually about to dig into. But essentially what we're talking about here is 7-digit, 10-digit, and 11-digit dialing. Those are the most popular dial patterns here in the United States. Internationally, you're going to have to figure out your own dial patterns, but it's going to very much come close to the rules that I'm setting up here. It might not just be, 10-digit or 11-digit. So we have area code, which is 3 digits, phone number, which is 7 digits, and then our country code is a 1, which would make an 11-digit dial. So 1 plus the 3-digit area code plus the 7-digit phone number. When you use an X in a dial pattern, that means match any digit from 0 to 9. So basically that's a wild card, if you will. A Z, which I never actually use Z, so I wouldn't worry about it, but that's going to match any digit from 1 to 9. And then an N is going to match any digit from 2 to 9. And where you would want to use that is that, for instance, the first number of a 7-digit phone number in the United States cannot be 1 or 0. Also, the first digit in an area code in the United States cannot be 1 or 0. So you'd have to use an N instead, which means any number except for 1 or 0. You can also just use regular digits if you want. There's wildcard matches. And then we have the prepend, prefix, and caller ID. So prepend is basically, if we match this dial pattern, we're going to add something onto the front of that dial pattern. Prefix is we are going to remove something from a matched dial pattern. So for instance, a lot of companies sometimes dial 9 to get an outside line. This really isn't done so much anymore, but it was done a lot more in the past where you'd pick up a phone, you'd dial 9, that would get you an outside line, so to speak, and then you could dial your phone number. Some people still want their phone systems set up that way because people are used to dialing that way, when in reality you don't actually have to dial 9 to get an outside line anymore. So you dial 9, area code, phone number, we're going to strip out that 9 when we send the call to the outside world, and that is how we do the prefix. But the prefix can also be used in situations where, for instance, if you dial out normally, your calls go out as one caller ID, but if you dial out with 9 and then a phone number, or 8 and then a phone number, you can pick a different caller ID phone number to dial out as. So we've used the prefix in that kind of situation where if someone dials 8 plus an area code and phone number, they go out as one caller ID, versus when they just dial the area code and phone number, they go out as a different caller ID. Sometimes that's useful if there are 2 organizations operating under the same umbrella and you want to be able to pick and choose, who you're appearing as when you're calling outbound. Then we have caller ID. So the caller ID field, I very, very rarely use this, but it says if caller ID is supplied, the dialed number will only match the pattern if the caller ID being transmitted matches this particular number. When extensions make outbound calls, the caller ID will be their extension number and not their outbound caller ID. So again, very rare that you would ever need to use this, but it is there if you do need it. So let's take a look at the patterns that were actually created. So here we have the first one, N, XXX, XXX. So an N and then 6 X's. This is a 7-digit dialing pattern for the United States, being that the first digit of the 7-digit dialing pattern is an N. It cannot be a 0 or 1. So it's an N, and then the rest of the digits can be anything. They can be anything 0 through 9. So we're matching that pattern. But in voice over IP world, and actually with a lot of local calls, even through POTS lines now, 7-digit dialing isn't really allowed anymore. I mean, in a lot of places it is, but it's becoming less and less popular. Mostly people do 10 or 11-digit dialing. So what we're going to do is if someone dials 7 digits, we're assuming that they're trying to get to the local area code where the phone system exists. So if someone dials 7 digits, we want to prepend to that phone number the local area code. In this case, it's going to be 1272. You could also do just 272, but I like to do 11-digit dials outbound. So basically, when we dial 555-1212, it's going to add 1272 to that number and then send it to the outside world. Okay, so here's a 10-digit dial pattern. NXX, that's your area code. Again, the first digit of an area code cannot be 0 or 1. That's why it's an N instead of an X. And then here's the same 7-digit pattern after the area code. So in the case of our example phone number for this outbound route, we are 272 and then 207-2040, right? So that is the full 10-digit number. But we're going to prepend a 1 on that because, like I said, I like to send out 11 digits. You don't have to send out 11 digits. It's just sort of habit for me. Now we have an 11-digit dial pattern right here. That one we don't need to modify because that is already an 11-digit dial pattern. If someone dials 11 digits, we're going to match it, and we just want to send that as is. But then we have a second 11-digit dial pattern. This is where I said there was going to be a duplicate. We had the 11-digit dial pattern and then the long distance that we chose when we did the wizard. This is the long distance one. It's actually just an 11-digit dial pattern. I don't know why they have two different options you can choose from, but whatever. So what I do here is I give it a plus. So if we match anything that is plus 1 NXX and XXXXXX, we're going to send that call out this route as is. The reason that we do this is there are some phones, I know Yealink is one, I don't know if they still do this, but at least historically they used to do this, where if you received a call on your phone, I should do it over here since this is my Yealink phone. If I received a call on this Yealink phone and that phone number ended up in this phone's history, and then I scroll through the history of this phone and I pick a phone number and I hit dial, Yealinks used to dial out with a plus on that redial, right? So if I scroll through history and just redial a number, it would dial out with a plus. And if you don't have this dial pattern that says plus 1 NXX NXXXXX, the call would fail. Okay, so that's why just out of habit, we add this in here to capture any older phones that might still prepend a plus or just have a plus on that redial. Okay, so let's go ahead and submit that, and we're going to apply config. Now let's talk about toll-free numbers. So in the United States, we're typically talking about 800 numbers, 888, 866, 877, I think 844 and 833, maybe even 855. I don't know. There's a whole bunch of different toll-free dial patterns that you can use in the United States. You can set those up separately. So think about this. The outbound route that we just created, this default outbound route, if I dial a toll-free number right now, it's going to catch that toll-free number, no problem, because it's going to match this 11-digit dial pattern here. So then why would we want to ever set up a different route specifically for toll-free numbers? And I will tell you why. It is because, let's go back to our main screen here. Sometimes organizations like to push out a toll-free number as their outbound caller ID. So if you're working for 1-800-Flowers, say, and you are an employee there and you make calls outbound, your outbound caller ID is probably going to be 1-800-Flowers, right? Whatever that equates to, number-wise. But in the United States, most toll-free companies or toll-free providers, if you have a toll-free number, you cannot accept calls from other toll-free numbers. So if you have a situation where your main outbound caller ID is a toll-free number, you'd want to add a separate outbound route we'll call this toll-free. We'll give it a non-toll-free outbound DID, like 272.207.2040. We're going to do the same thing by choosing all of our different routes for outbound. And then for dial patterns, we're only going to match toll-free, US toll-free dial patterns, generate routes. So 800, 888, 877, 866, 855, 4433, right? And then let's go ahead and submit that. You might also want to add the equivalent 10-digit toll-free dial patterns as well. I am just not adding that for sake of time here. So then once we've added it, we can scroll this up here. And then now any phone number, because these patterns are matched in order. So anytime we match a pattern, we don't keep looking through the list. So if you have a toll-free number that you've dialed, it's going to immediately match this toll-free dial pattern and then send the call out with the rules for this toll-free outbound route. If it's not toll-free, it's then going to drop down to the default route where you might have an outbound caller ID of a toll-free line. So we'll say that's our example right there. So this is where you would maybe want to separate out toll-free numbers. Again, if your main outbound caller ID for normal calls is a toll-free number, you cannot use that when dialing other toll-free numbers. So then you would want a separate toll-free route that only has a local caller ID as the outbound ID. Okay, so let's go back into our default route here. I'm actually going to change this back since we don't really need that toll-free thing. I'm going to change it back, but let's also submit that. Let's also take a look at some of these other tabs. So we have an import-export patterns. This is basically if you want to import or export your dial patterns, right? So you can export your dial patterns. If you have a really complicated dial plan and you want to export that as a CSV and then import it into a different outbound route, you can do that. You can also just duplicate here. But for instance, if you're migrating between FreePBX systems or you just want to copy it to a different FreePBX system, you have that option. If we click on notifications, we can send an email notification if a call is successful or if a dial pattern is matched. This is typically useful when we're talking about emergency calls. So for instance, if an emergency call if a dial pattern is matched for an emergency phone call, we want to send an email to a particular, group of contacts that just says, hey, someone just made a 911 call, right? So that's what notifications is for. For the most part, you can use it for other things too. And then we have additional settings where we have a call recording, and then here is pin set. So if you remember pin set I talked about, for international dialing, you might want to set pin codes for each different user so that they have to dial, a 3 or 4 digit pin code in order to make a successful international outbound call. That's where you would set that up, again, beyond the scope of this video. But what is not beyond the scope of this video is our emergency outbound route. This is very, very important. And with the new Kerry's Law and Ray-Baum Act regulations here in the United States, when you are setting up a phone system, either you're setting it up as an MSP or a solution provider on behalf of a company, or you work for a company and you're setting it up for your own company, you have to deal with 911. Every single extension in the system has to be able to dial 911 by law. And if it can't, and someone dials 911 and the authorities don't get there and someone gets seriously injured, or if they, die, you could be held responsible for that, meaning you, the company, or even you, the installer of the phone system, if you're the one who didn't set up 911 properly. So when I say it's very important, it's literally the most important thing that I'm going to talk about in this entire series, right? Set up 911, dial it in properly for all of your locations. And I will throw in this, if you need help setting up 911, we are experts in Kerry's Law and Ray-Baum Act compliance, and we will be happy to help you out and make sure that you are compliant with those regulations and that your system is set up correctly so that 911 calls always work for every extension. Okay, all that being said, let's add an emergency outbound route. We're just going to call this emergency. The route caller ID is going to be your E911 DID. For this video, we're going to assume it's the same number we've been using, 272.207.2040, but you will know if that's an E911 number because you will have set that up as an E911 number with whatever carrier you choose to go with. So if you go with Crosstalk SIP, you can choose to set up any of your DIDs in the Crosstalk SIP user portal as emergency DIDs, as E911 phone numbers that have an associated emergency address. Then we want to click on emergency. In this case, you never really want to override the extension. And this is why. Because we're making this an emergency outbound route. And so what does that do? Essentially, this means when you have set this as an emergency outbound route, this route will always use this caller ID as the outbound phone number for dialing emergency services, unless you have the emergency route caller ID setting set on a per extension basis. This is important. Let me go show you an extension. So if I go over here to, let me save this. Oh, you got to select the dial pattern tab. All right, we're going to have to come back to that because I got to do, you know what, forget. I will just scrap this one and we'll come back and set it up again. This is important. Let me show you the extension. So if I go to extensions, and then let's look at any extension. We'll look at Stanley Hudson here. And then right here, we have emergency caller ID. So let's say that Stanley works from home. Okay, when Stanley makes regular calls outbound to clients or vendors or whomever he's talking to, we want to send those calls out as the caller ID of the company, the main caller ID on whatever default outbound route Stanley happens to be using. But if there's an emergency at Stanley's house and Stanley picks up that phone and dials 911, we do not want to send out the E911 address for the business. We want to send out the E911 address for Stanley's home, right? So to make this easier, we set a different number here. We'll say 272-207-2041. Again, this is a number I just made up. That's not actually a DID that I own. But we're going to set a different emergency caller ID, and this DID is going to have the E911 address of Stanley's home. That way, when Stanley's phone dials 911, even though it goes out the emergency route, now we'll go set up the other emergency route. So going back to outbound routes, add, we're going to do emergency, and we're going to add our normal office E911 DID, 272-207-2040. But since we've designated this as an emergency outbound route, it's going to listen to Stanley's extension when he dials 911, and it's going to use his extension's emergency caller ID and not this emergency route's caller ID. Right? So very important. That's how you can have different employees at home where they're dialing out just like they're in the office until they dial 911, and then we're sending out a different phone number that has the correct address for where that emergency might be taking place. Okay, so now let's go ahead and add our same outbound trunk selection. 5, there we go. And then we want to come over here to dial patterns. We're going to click dial patterns wizards again. This time we're going to uncheck everything except for US emergency. And you'll notice, by the way, that all of the wizards are US based. You're going to have to make changes based on your own location. I know emergency services in other countries aren't 911. So find out what the emergency services in your country are and then set them appropriately. So we're going to say US emergency, generate routes. And this gives us 911, 911, we're stripping out a 1, 911, we're stripping out a 9, and then 911, and we're stripping out 91. This means that calls will go to 911 if we've dialed 911, 1911, 9911, or 91911, right? So all of those patterns are going to match based on the default routes that you can create in the wizard. And you can add more if you want, even. But that's what we're trying to do, is just make sure that anyone who dials 911 in any flavor or variation, it's going to capture that call and send it to emergency services. We also have 933. So 933 is used for a number of locations, including Crosstalk SIP, where when you dial 933, it just reads you back the E911 address that you've input. It's a way to verify 911 emergency services addresses are working properly without actually dialing 911. You know, when we used to set up phone systems, we used to have to call 911 to test it and say, this is a test call. I'm testing a new phone system. Can you verify the address that you received? Right, which is always a little sketchy. You don't ever want to have to dial 911. And so 933 is a way to just run a test that tells you, it reads back what the address is. And we'll try that here in just a moment. The other one that I'm going to add here is 988. I like to have this in all of our systems. This is the U.S. National Suicide Prevention Hotline. And, you know, again, if anyone ever happens to need to dial 988, I want to be able to facilitate that call. So we add in 988 as well. We don't need to worry about any of these tabs. Notifications is probably something that you would want to set up for 911 dialing. Again, if we match any of these dial patterns, we're going to send an email to a contact or group of people that will be notified that someone dialed 911, and it has all of this information: call time, call, who it came from, where it was dialing, when it was sent, etc., etc. And then finally, under additional settings for call recording, I always force call recording on 911 calls. You know, again, check the recording laws in your state. It's very possible that even if you recorded a 911 call, if you have a two-party consent state versus a one-party consent state or whatever, you would not be able to use this call recording in a court of law. But I like to have the call recording anyways. However, again, let me caveat this as strongly as I can. I am not a lawyer. I am not an expert in recording consent on a per state or per country basis. So take a look at this setting and choose what you want to do. I'm going to set this to force because I like to have a recording anytime someone dials 911. All right, so we're going to submit that and apply config. And let's try dialing 933. By the way, emergency route, I'm going to drag to the very top of this list. Okay, we're going to drag that to the top of the list. And we're going to apply a config one more time. And let's go ahead and dial out to 933 to test it. 933.
Your number 272-207-2040 for Crosstalk Solutions is provisioned for 911. The pre-provision address.
We're not going to say the address, but you can hear what it said. It said the pre-provision address is, and then it reads back the actual address. So it's a good way to test 911 dialing services. Now, not all providers provide 933, but the good ones do, right? So make sure you have a provider. You can ask them if they allow for 933 emergency testing. Okay, so let's try a regular call outbound. I'm going to call my cell phone here. And the call's working, and we can see the caller ID is the one that I have set on the outbound route, the 2040. Hello, hello.
Hello?
Test, test, test.
Test, test, test.
Check, check, check.
Check, check, check.
Test, test, test. Check, 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 check. Okay. And we also have two-way audio. Okay, so let's do another thing. Remember I talked about the dial 8 to get a different caller ID? Let's go ahead and set that up as well. We're going to add a new outbound route. We'll call this dial 8. And we're going to give it a different caller ID. The caller ID is going to be 272-770-0266. It's just another DID that I have provisioned to this server. It's not going to be emergency. We're going to do Crosstalk SIP outbound 1, outbound 2, outbound 3, outbound 4, outbound 5. Let's go over to our dial patterns. We're going to do our dial patterns wizard and generate. We're going to add 1272. A 1 here, and then a +1 here. So I did that very quickly, right? But this is the same setup that I did at the very beginning of this video. But this time, I want to add in this dial 8 prefix. So we're going to say 8 prefix, 8 prefix, 8 prefix. So what this means is if I dial 8 plus 11 digits, or 8 plus 10 digits, or 8 plus 7 digits, this is all still going to work. The prefix is what we are stripping off of the number. So in this case, if I dial 8 and then 11 digits, so 1 NXX and XXXXXX, and actually I don't need this +1 here, I'm going to get rid of that. So if I dial 8 plus 11 digits, it's going to strip off the 8 and then send the 11 digits. If I dial 8 plus 10 digits, it's going to strip off the 8 and then add a 1 in its place and just send the 11 digits. If I just dial 7 digits, 8 plus 7 digits, it's going to strip off the 8 and then dial 1272 plus the 7 digits. So now let's test that out. Remember when I called a second ago, I dialed normally and I had a caller ID on my cell phone that ended in 2040. Now we're going to dial my cell phone, but I'm going to dial 8 plus my cell phone number, and we're going to get a different caller ID. Let's go ahead and do that now. Sending that call. And call's coming through, and you can see that the caller ID ends in 0266 because it is coming from, check. Test, check. It is coming from that dial 8 dial pattern that we created. So you can do a lot of fancy stuff with dial patterns. This is just the tip of the iceberg. This is the basics to get you started. And in the next video, we're going to talk about inbound routes so that we can actually receive calls and route those calls to different places based on the phone number that people dialed into our organization. All right, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you give me a thumbs up, and we will see you in the next one.